Late one evening, a group of school students and teachers were on a bus heading to Shimla when their journey took a sudden halt. The bus broke down in the middle of a dense forest, far from any town or help. It was already dark, and the teachers decided that the best option was to find a nearby place to stay for the night. They planned to call a mechanic in the morning to fix the bus before continuing their trip. Fortunately, they found a small hotel nestled between towering trees and mountains. The hotel had an eerie atmosphere, but with no other options, the teachers checked in and assigned the students to different rooms. After dinner, everyone retired to their rooms to rest. Among the students were three close friends, Ayu, Aman, and Rohan. They were thrilled to share a room together. From their window, they could see a distant lake shimmering in the moonlight, surrounded by dense forest. This reminded them of a story from a previous school trip when two students had snuck out at night to explore and became the talk of the school. Excited by the idea of doing something adventurous, the three boys decided to sneak out to the lake, take some photos, and return before anyone noticed. Once the hotel guard fell asleep, Ayu, Aman, and Rohan quietly slipped out of the hotel. The lake didn't seem too far away, but as they walked deeper into the forest, the path seemed to stretch on endlessly. The night grew colder, and the thick canopy of trees blocked out the moonlight, leaving them with only the flashlights from their phones to guide the way. After what felt like half an hour of walking, they realized they were lost. Their phones had no signal, and the temperature kept dropping. Feeling uneasy, they decided to abandon their plan and return to the hotel. As they turned to go back, Ayu and Aman realized something alarming. Rohan was no longer with them. They called out his name, but there was no answer. Suddenly they heard footsteps rushing through the underbrush, as if someone was running away. Terrified but unwilling to leave Rohan behind, they followed the sound of the footsteps deeper into the forest. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The forest was deathly quiet, and Rohan was still nowhere to be found. Then, from a short distance away, they heard a strange sound, like someone digging in the ground. Ayu and Aman cautiously made their way toward the noise. When they finally saw what was happening, their hearts raced with fear. Rohan was standing in the middle of a clearing, digging a hole in the earth with his bare hands. His face was pale, and when he turned to look at them, his eyes were completely black, void of any emotion or life. It was as if something had possessed him. Aman, trying to stay calm, approached Rohan and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Rohan, what's wrong?" he asked. But before Aman could get another word out, Rohan let out a blood-curdling scream and shoved Aman with incredible force, sending him flying several feet across the ground. Ayu ran to Aman's side, helping him up. Meanwhile, Rohan began convulsing violently, as if he was having a seizure. Then, just as suddenly, he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. And Aman stared at each other in shock, unsure of what to do next. After a few tense moments, Rohan began to stir and slowly regained consciousness. But when he opened his eyes, they were still black, and he let out a terrifying scream. Aman, still shaken from being thrown earlier, sat with his head down, trembling. But then something strange happened. Aman suddenly raised his head, and to Ayu's horror, his eyes were now just as black as Rohan's had been. Before either of them could react, Aman stood up and bolted into the forest, running as if he were being controlled by something else. Rohan and Ayu, driven by fear and confusion, chased after him. Their flashlights flickered in the darkness as they followed Aman to the edge of the forest, where an old, dilapidated house stood. The house looked like it had been abandoned for decades, with rotting wood and shattered windows. It was the last place anyone would want to enter, but with Aman running inside, they had no choice. They cautiously entered the house, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As they ventured deeper, they found Aman in a large, empty room, suspended in midair, unconscious. Standing beneath him was an old woman, her face twisted and deformed. Her eyes were completely black, just like Aman's and Rohan's. Her skin was loose and sagging, and her long, tangled white hair hung down her back. She mumbled incoherent words as she stood under the floating body of Aman. Ayu and Rohan froze in terror. The sight of the old woman was too much to bear. They turned and ran as fast as they could back toward the door. But the old woman had seen them. She let out a low, guttural growl and started crawling toward them, her limbs moving unnaturally, almost like an insect. Ayu and Rohan ran down the stairs, but when they glanced back, they saw her slithering down the steps, getting closer with every second. They burst out of the house and into the forest, running blindly through the trees. Their hearts pounded in their chests, and their lungs burned from the cold air. In their panic, they didn't realize they had reached the lake, the very place they had been looking for earlier. Exhausted and disoriented, Ayu and Rohan stumbled into the water. As soon as they hit the surface, they felt something pulling them down, as if the lake itself was alive and trying to drown them. Ayu fought with all his strength and managed to drag himself out of the water, but when he looked back, he saw Rohan being pulled under, disappearing into the depths of the lake. Helpless and terrified, Ayu could do nothing but watch as his friend vanished beneath the water. Overcome with fear and exhaustion, Ayu collapsed on the shore and lost consciousness. The next morning, Ayu woke up in his hotel room. Confused and terrified, he rushed outside. The hotel grounds were swarming with police, and on the ground, covered in white sheets, lay the lifeless bodies of Rohan and Aman. The police had declared their deaths as murders, but when Ayu overheard some of the locals speaking, he learned a different story. Years ago, a woman had lived alone in the forest, in the very house they had entered. She lived a peaceful life, but one day some men from a nearby village tried to take her land. They mistreated her, killed her, and threw her body into the lake. Since then, her vengeful spirit had haunted the forest, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to venture too close to the lake at night. If only Ayu, Aman, and Rohan had known this dark legend, they might have avoided the fate that awaited them.